Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shankar Shastri. I'm the Dean of the College of Engineering, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's program, which is this year's Minna Distinguished Lecture. I'm just delighted to see such a diverse and lively mix of guests with us today. I'm especially happy to extend a special welcome to our colleagues from the Goldman School of Public Policy, our collaborators in organizing this lecture. We also welcome our alumni, parents, friends of both Berkeley Engineering and the Goldman School. Each of you is a valuable partner who helps us fulfill our educational mission. We are grateful for your support. In a moment, Dean Henry Brady of the Goldman School will introduce our topic and speakers. But first, let me tell you a little bit about our Minna Distinguished Lecture, how it began, and why today's program exemplifies what the Minna Lecture is about. 5 years ago, Berkeley Engineering alumnus Warren Minna and his wife, Marjorie, established an endowment to support the teaching of ethics and social responsibility here in the College of Engineering. Warren and Marjorie sought to promote a greater understanding of the impact that science and engineering can have on society. They also wanted to ensure that our students had learned how to read technological innovation in ways that serve the public interest. Our annual Minna Distinguished Lecture is supported by Warren and Marjorie's generous gift. Each year, we've been honored to invite leading global citizens to Berkeley to share their own perspectives at the intersection of technology, business, and public policy. And today's program is a perfect illustration. The Iridium project began as a revolutionary idea coming out of Motorola's research labs, the same labs where the cell phone originated. The dramatic story that follows, one that spans Earth, space, Wall Street, and Washington, D.C., is truly remarkable, a story that shows us how powerful technology can be in shaping our world and fulfilling human potential. Let me now invite Dean Brady to introduce John Bloom, author of Eccentric Orbits, the Iridium Story, and our panelists.
Thanks, Shankar. So as you will see, this is an incredible story that involves a visionary engineer, Ray Leopold, a true great American entrepreneur, Dan Colussy, an enlightened public bureaucrat, Dorothy Robyn, and as every story with any substance requires, there's got to be a chronicler, a bard, somebody who writes it down and puts it together. And John Bloom has done that brilliantly in Eccentric Orbits. He's a veteran investigative journalist, three-time finalist for the National Magazine Award, long-term columnist for the New York Times Syndicate, written for many other publications. He's the author of 9 books, including one, Evidence of Love, that was made into an Emmy-winning film. He's been a television personality, a writer of movie reviews. Some of you may know his other personality, let us say, and the star of a one-man stage review. He's enormously talented, and Eccentric Orbits has been called as fascinating, remarkable piece of storytelling, a monumental piece of nonfiction, and both a novelistic thriller and a cautionary tale. John Bloom.
Thank you, Dean. I appreciate it. Let me just say, I'm very happy to be here today. I'm always happy to speak to a smart audience, and I spoke to you, some of you before we got started, and I can tell there are a lot of engineers here, and so I'm going to give you the tough version of my talk, because I know you guys will understand it. There's only one phone that works on every inch of the planet, and that's the Iridium phone. You can stand on the North Pole, and you can call somebody who's standing on the South Pole. You can stand on the most isolated part of the Amazon rainforest, and you can call somebody that's on a ship in the middle of the Indian Ocean. The only reason that phone exists today, saving lives all over the world, making business possible in places that have never had telephone access, making soldiers safe in the Middle East, is that the 3 people who are appearing with me today, one is an engineer, one is a businessman, one is a White House economist, took chances that nobody else would take. They stood up to conventional wisdom. They said there's a better way to do things, and they were tough enough to believe in possibilities that no one else believed in. This is actually a one-of-a-kind occasion that you're here for today because it's the first time that all three of them have been in the same room. But Ray Leopold, here on the front row, is the inventor of the Iridium system, way back in 1980, starting in 1987 when it was first conceived. Dan Colussy on the second row here is the savior of Iridium. And Dorothy Robyn, also on the first row, is the special assistant in the Bill Clinton White House, who was pretty much the only person in the government who saw the genius of what Ray had built and believed in Dan Colussy enough to support him in his heroic 11th hour efforts to save it. But we'll get to all that in just a minute. In 1990, at the Hayden Planetarium in New York City, the Motorola Corporation, which at that time was the largest, most powerful electronics company in the world, and was the only American company that could go up against the Japanese companies and win, announced the most expensive and complicated engineering project in history. Now, when I say that, some people say, well, what about Los Alamos? It was more complicated than Los Alamos, because at Los Alamos they were only doing one thing, and in Iridium they were doing dozens of things. What it was is a system of 66 satellites, autonomous action satellites, that would function as cell phone towers in the sky. And for the first time, every inch of the planet would be accessible by phone. Now, these were low Earth orbit satellites. They were just 485 miles up instead of the usual 22,000 miles up of the geostationary orbit. They were arrayed in 6 planes around the planet, 11 satellites to a plane. And these 66 satellites would race up one side of the Earth, cross at the poles, and then race down the other side in a staggered pattern that allowed them to instantaneously make switching decisions in space, and allowed, depending on where you were, where the two callers were on Earth, as many as 12 satellites could cooperate on a single phone call without the signal ever touching Earth. These satellites were an outgrowth of the Star Wars system. If you guys remember the Star Wars system, that was a system of satellites commissioned by President Reagan in the early 80s that was designed to track Russian missiles, turn their own nuclear power back on the Russian missiles, and blow them out of the air. There were 3 parts of the Star Wars system. It was never built, but it had one technological feature that had never been tried before, and that was that the satellites could talk to one another in space. And they could cooperate and make autonomous decisions. So in Star Wars, they cooperated on how to blow up the Russian missiles, and for Iridium, they cooperated by being switchboards in space. And so a phone call never had to touch an Earth station, never had to touch a landline. So this was the first system of interlinked satellites that was ever put into space. Most satellite systems are controlled by a mission control system on the ground, and all the software is on the ground. This software is uploaded daily. The software is all in the sky. So the telephone industry at the time thought that we would eventually all be walking around using satellite phones. They thought that was the future of the telecommunications business, because how could you possibly build enough cell towers to cover the Earth? And a lot of the Earth you can't build towers anyway. And let me talk about that a minute, because you guys will understand this. The reason you see all these commercials on TV by Verizon and Sprint and AT&T showing their coverage map is that nobody has decent coverage. It's not that they all have good coverage, it's that no one has good and decent coverage. If you have any doubt about that, take a cross-country Amtrak trip and count the number of times your phone loses service on that one trip. So they can't even get universal coverage in the United States, which is the country with the best service in the world. So how can you can imagine what it's like in the less developed parts of the world. Cell phones work only on about 12% of the surface of the Earth. And the reason is, it's impossible to build enough cell towers. You obviously can't put them in the middle of the ocean. You can't put them in places that have a lot of mountain peaks. In fact, if you got into a motorboat right here on San Francisco Bay and went across the Sausalito, you'd probably lose your signal right in the middle of San Francisco Bay. So even if you get a little ways out offshore, you've already lost the cell signal. Plus, it costs trillions of dollars just to maintain the cell towers that we already have. So You have to have a cell tower every 1 to 5 miles for every service provider. Depends on the terrain, depends on the population density, but you can have them as close as 1 mile apart, as many as 5 miles apart. And we have $1 trillion worth of them in service. They break down all the time. A hurricane can take them out. A tornado can take them out. Severe thunderstorms can take them out. And they're extremely dangerous. So many people get killed or permanently injured working on cell towers that there are entire law firms that just specialize in the liability for that. When you have any kind of natural disaster or terrorist situation, the first thing that fails is the cell phone system. And if you ask people in Florida and Louisiana what they're panicking about in the aftermath of a hurricane, it's not, will I have food and water? It's, will my smartphone work? And the answer is, no, it will not work. So the Motorola idea made a lot of sense in 1987. It makes a lot of sense today, actually. So they built the system. The system worked. It was acclaimed by systems engineers all over the world. And so why, when I met Dan Colussy 19 years later in 2009, had I never heard of the Iridium system? I met Dan Colussy through a mutual friend of ours, and he was interested in getting somebody to help edit his memoirs. And in the course of doing that, he kind of told me the outlines of the Iridium story. And I said, wait, what? Tell me that again. He told me again. Tell me that story again, Dan, because I don't believe you. They did what? And he just told me the general outlines of the story of what happened. The stories about the Pentagon, the Clinton White House, the Secretary of Defense. There was a telephone company in Saudi Arabia that was owned by the bin Laden group. And all of that was fascinating. But the main thing he showed me was a 3D file of these satellites in motion. And it was beautiful. They were beautiful. And now engineers, you're not what I call a romantic bunch. But I have a passage in my book about the huge number of people over the years who fell in love with the satellite constellation. And that's the language they would use. They would say, I loved those satellites. You know, my satellites were gorgeous, you know, and many of them used the word "my" for the satellites as though they were in love. And in their more sober moments, if they were writing about it, they would say elegant, you know. It was an elegant constellation, which, as I understand it, is pretty much the highest praise that one engineer gives to another engineer, you know. But most people, when they think about satellites, they think of them as, you know, reflectors for TV signals, for radio signals, the kind that hover over the equator, and that is 90% of the satellites. These are nothing like that. These are in low Earth orbit, traveling around, not around the equator, but over the poles. And so the same satellite passes over the North Pole 14 times a day. It's traveling at 17,000 miles an hour, and in the course of its journey, because the Earth is rotating underneath the orbital path, it will pass over every inch of the Earth's surface. And the signal on an Iridium phone is instantaneous. You know, there's a delay, but the time of the delay starts 0.00000. So it's not like those TV reporters who have to wait 6 seconds to get their response back from the anchor desk. So I heard this story from Mr. Colussy about one of the most amazing engineering projects of the last century that became the biggest bankruptcy in American history. Now, it was 1 year before Enron, so the record got broken pretty fast. But if you ask a Wall Street guy, what do you remember about Iridium? He'll say, oh, huge flame out. Oh, Motorola screwed that thing up. Oh, Motorola wanted to crash those things into the ocean. They probably should have crashed those things into the ocean. So I'm hearing this sort of bipolar story, you know. Yes, on the one hand, it was the greatest engineering project ever conceived. Yes, it was the biggest bankruptcy in history, but I'm hearing it years after the main events. And so I say, Dan, I think this is a book. Dan didn't really think it was a book. And I said, Dan, I think this is a book. I'm going to go off and ask some questions about it. And I go off and talk to people who are associated with Iridium and associated with Motorola, and I ask all the obvious questions. And there are a remarkable number of people that don't want to talk to me, that are hostile towards me. Now, nothing makes a reporter more interested in a story than people refusing to talk about it. So Bill Clinton didn't want to talk about it, and Bill Clinton's people didn't want to talk about it. Al Gore didn't want to talk about it. Al Gore's people didn't want to talk about it, even though they were involved in it. The Secretary of Defense, Bill Cohen, he really didn't want to talk about it at all. 90% of the people involved at the Motorola Corporation just didn't want to talk about it. So who wanted to talk about it? The engineers really wanted to talk about it. The scientists wanted to talk about it. The civil servants wanted to talk about it. The bureaucrats wanted to talk about it. And what they would say was startling. For example, the first question, obviously, is how does this happen? How do you eat through $11 billion? That's how much debt they were in when they went bankrupt. You eat through $11 billion in 9 months. They were only in business 9 months. And you bankrupt a company that's been in the works for 12 years. Well, maybe it was because the phone weighed almost a pound. It was a brick long after the age of the brick had passed. And Motorola, by the way, was the inventor of the brick, the Dynatac, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. But the Iridium phone resembled a World War II walkie-talkie with this giant antenna on it. So it was not just a brick, it was a brick with a baguette sticking out of it. And it sold for $3,500. So that's the first reason that the business plan might have failed. And then there was the second reason that the business plan might have failed, and that was because Motorola was seeking this elusive creature called the international business traveler. This was the guy who needs to be connected wherever he goes in the world, and by the time they developed the phone, he already had a slim phone that worked on the GSM system, which was new at the time. So his phone was capable of roaming. Now, roaming was one of the most unpopular features ever foisted on the consumer, but when you needed it, it worked. And the GSM phone, it didn't work everywhere. It didn't work in the ocean. It didn't work at the South Pole. It wasn't global. It just worked where the people are. So eventually, I asked the question, all right, so who came up with the whole idea of Iridium in the first place? And the answer is 3 engineers in the most obscure part of the Motorola Corporation. In fact, so obscure they called it Motorola Siberia, and that was the Chandler Lab in Chandler, Arizona. And Ray Leopold was the principal dreamer of the 3-man team that came up with the idea. In fact, he's the one who figured out the 66 satellite constellation that would cover the Earth. He figured out the proper height of the orbits, how the phone would connect when they were traveling at such high speeds, because Ray is an ex-Air Force colonel who had worked on Star Wars, as many other people at Motorola had. But he thought things could be done better in the private sector. Normally with a cell phone, either the tower is not moving or the phone is not moving. Here you had both a moving phone and a moving cell tower. And sometimes the cell tower is moving at 17,000 miles per hour, and the phone is moving at 600 miles per hour because it's in the cockpit of an airplane. And so working out the algorithms for that was nightmarish, and that was just one of the algorithms that they had to work out. But these 3 engineers, working alone, working against the whole culture of their own corporation, working in an environment where people kept telling them that what they were doing was garbage, working with intense corporate espionage. The French government bugged their hotel rooms, rifled through their suitcases. They painstakingly developed the design of something that had never been attempted. Just the number of rocket launches that they needed to do this system was unheard of at the time, was groundbreaking. They were going to need 17 launches, and no one in private industry had ever launched that many satellites for one project. And because they were using rockets from China and Russia, those launches had to be coordinated with the governments of China and Russia. And those were 2 countries where Americans had never even been allowed to see the launch facility in the early 90s. Why were they thinking this big? Why were they thinking so globally? Because Ray Leopold and his colleagues believed that the future of the world would have millions of people using satellite phones. Now, the next question is, why didn't the rest of the world think that? The rest of the world did think that. There were at least a dozen satellite phone companies that were formed in the early 90s to copy Iridium or to do a cheaper version of Iridium, including one created by Bill Gates and Craig McCaw called the teledesic system that would have provided internet in the sky. So the next question, well, what happened to all those companies? Well, they went bankrupt too. So the next question is, so why did Iridium survive? Because of this one man, Dan Colussy, who was a retired businessman, who was enjoying his retirement. He was playing golf in Palm Beach, Florida, and he had no previous experience with satellites or telecommunications or outer space, and he didn't have money of his own to buy a satellite system. But one thing I've learned about Dan is he's one of the best listeners that I've ever met in my life. And he had sat on a lot of boards of a lot of corporations. He was exposed to a lot of related industries. He knew enough about aerospace to know that a lot of what was being said about these satellites was more about panic than about reason. And so he set out on his own to save the constellation. Okay, so from my point of view, what do you do when all these people don't want to talk to you? You go get their email. And so what I did is I filed a Freedom of Information Act request, and the result of that is that they turned up 18,000 pages of documents dealing with Iridium, all stored at the William Jefferson Clinton Library in Little Rock, Arkansas. And then they wouldn't give me the documents. They said, they were teasing me. They said, well, Clinton has to read those first before those can be released. And I said, well, Clinton is not going to read those. Well, Clinton's people have to read those. And then they said, oh, well, Obama has to read them now. Or Obama's people have to read them now. So it was like next month, next month, next month. Yeah, you're going to get your documents. Yeah, next month, next month. But they say, but you may not get all 18,000. So I'm thinking, at the end of this process, they're going to even give me 5 pages of documents. And I was actually ready to go ahead and write the book without the documents. And then lo and behold, they did release 17,000 of the 18,000 pages of Iridium documents. That's the good news. The bad news is now I have to read 17,000 pages of government documents at the Clinton Library in Little Rock, Arkansas, because they're not going to email them to me. And so those included hundreds of pages of handwritten notes. That's when I discovered Dorothy Robyn. Dorothy's official title at the time was Special Assistant to the President. And she was known in the White House Economic Policy Office as a problem solver and a troubleshooter, and especially in areas that were traditionally dominated by men, like shipbuilding, military bases, aerospace, international telecommunications. Those were Dorothy's areas. So at the Clinton Library, I find hundreds of pages of yellow legal paper, handwritten, no dates on it. Dorothy, for future historians, please date your pages, date your yellow pages. Yeah, boy. Phone calls, meetings, fact-seeking sessions, fights in the White House Situation Room. And so what I'm gathering from the hours it takes to decipher these notes is that one government bureaucrat, I don't want to say bureaucrat, you were more than a bureaucrat, you were a, special advisor, is fighting the various people at the White House and at the Pentagon and at a dozen other government agencies who apparently don't care if the most complex engineering project in the world is destroyed. And in fact, Dorothy was told by the White House legal office, Dorothy, stay off of this, don't get involved in this bankruptcy, limit yourself to safety issues, that's all you can do. Dorothy just decided to ignore that particular directive and set out to help save the satellites from imminent destruction. So at the point we are, Motorola has now built the satellites. They've created a multinational corporation to market the satellites. They've formed partnerships with businessmen and governments all over the world. In fact, it's the first global corporation representing every country in the world. But now the business plan has failed, so they decide to just crash the satellites into the ocean. Actually, they couldn't guarantee that they would crash into the ocean because they were extremely lightweight satellites, and so they were just 1,400 pounds, so they were going to flutter around in the atmosphere and come down wherever they pleased come down, which frightened the hell out of NASA, which was sort of semi-responsible for space junk. So enter Dan Colussy. Dan Colussy decides on his own he won't let this happen, and he starts putting together a group of investors that can try to buy the satellites out of bankruptcy and use them. But he just got involved with this. He didn't know, what are we going to use them for? It's a kind of thorny, complicated problem that you would normally study for months, if not years. He has weeks, if not days. In fact, when he first became involved, they told him he had 9 days until the satellites would be destroyed. So Dan calls on his Harvard Business School background and his business career, and he asks the obvious questions. Where's the revenue? Who's the customer for these things? Obviously, it's not the international business traveler. If I do save the phones, who's going to use the phones? Who can't live without the phone? The answer was very interesting. CIA agents working alone really liked this phone. Drug enforcement agents liked it even more than the CIA agents, especially the ones that were stationed in the jungles of Colombia. Marines in small units in Bosnia, oil exploration companies in remote places, small craft on the open sea, fishermen everywhere, mining companies in the most isolated parts of Africa, trekkers at the North Pole, but especially guys with secret identities who sneak across borders in the dead of night. That's who really wanted this phone. So Dan thinks it's obvious. I'll go to the Pentagon. Obviously, you guys want this phone. Nope, they tell him. Nah, we're not interested in that. The military uses secure phones that we own that are run from Cheyenne Mountain. We don't use phones that anybody can buy that were invented for playboys in Monaco, so go away. The Navy, which considers itself the expert in communications, they were especially negative. Or were they? Because when he first went to the Pentagon, an enthusiastic, youthful civilian suddenly shows up to, quote, guide you through the process. Now, this guy's name was Mark Adams, and he had strange credentials from the MITRE Corporation. Do you guys know the MITRE Corporation? It's a place where they do secret research for the government. It was originally created in the 1950s when President Eisenhower gave the order to automate war. If you remember those giant computers in Dr. Strangelove, those were the SAGE computers created by MITRE. At any rate, the MITRE Corporation has always been a favorite of conspiracy theorists, especially since it's where they invented the internet, and because almost all the CEOs are ex-heads of the CIA. So this guy from the MITRE Corporation shows up out of nowhere, and normally when you go to the Pentagon, you have to sit around in the waiting room all day waiting for your meeting, and then the guy, the little enlisted man comes out and walks you a half a mile to the office where you're going to have your meeting. But in this case, the MITRE guy is right there to guide you through the process. So Dan Colussy had been president of Pan Am World Airways back in the 70s when they were hijacking his planes every month and flying them to Cuba. So he was somewhat familiar with government agents, and his spook detector went off when Mark Adams showed up. And so he knew obviously somebody was watching this process. And from there, the story got stranger and stranger and stranger. The spies wanted the phone, but the generals did not want the phone. The Marines at Camp Pendleton, who are the first responders in war, they wanted the phone because it worked on the move and it was handheld. In fact, it would later prove indispensable in Afghanistan and in Iraq. The scientists in charge of operations at the South Pole, they were begging for the phone. They were actually having to fly data in and out of the South Pole. So let me put this in context. We have a satellite constellation that's conservatively estimated to be worth $6.5 billion. It's about to be destroyed by its operator, the Motorola Corporation, at a time when any Fortune 500 corporation in America could acquire it for pocket change. But there are no bidders, and the military is not inclined to help. In fact, Dan Colussy went to Motorola at their world headquarters in Chicago, and they openly scoffed at him. They said, surely you don't think you can use this thing for data? Surely you don't think your little misfit band of undercapitalized investors can run a satellite system? He actually did have a way to use it for data, but he didn't say that because they would have scoffed at him more. But he goes to all the other co-owners of Iridium. There were 28 companies around the world that had a stake in Iridium, but they're in a rage. They feel like Motorola sold them this white elephant, and they have this worthless company on their hands, so none of them want to put up the money to get it out of bankruptcy. He goes to every service provider in the world, telling them, look, you can own this system for pennies on the dollar. Actually, it would turn out to be mills on the dollar, but nobody knew that yet. But no one was willing to take a chance on the system. He goes to an investment banker that he's known for 35 years, one of his close classmates at Harvard Business School, and that guy promises to put up enough money to buy the system out of bankruptcy and run it for a year, and then backs out at the last minute very publicly, issuing a statement to the New York Times that in his estimation, the system is worthless. In fact, that statement was so public that the State Department informed Russia that non-nuclear debris would be coming out of the sky so that they didn't mistake the falling satellites for incoming missiles. Meanwhile, the government is panicking. There's 12 different agencies that are writing memos, making plans for the moment when I think it was 88 satellites, because there were spares up there, are jolted out of their flight path and allowed to plunge to Earth. Especially annoyed was the president, Bill Clinton, who says, I won't let that happen. That's not going to happen on my watch. Only to be informed by his lieutenants that he had no authority over the satellites because they were launched entirely by private industry. And in fact, there were foreign governments that are owners of the system, including China and Russia, whereas the Pentagon was a mere customer. So China and Russia had more control over what happens to these satellites than we did. The only person who does not give up, constantly warning the government not to get ahead of itself, is Dorothy Robyn. And then listen to this part very carefully, because you're not going to believe it. The owner of the Black Entertainment Network asked one of his female talk show hostesses to set up a meeting with the Secretary of Defense so that some friends of Jesse Jackson could buy the Iridium system to provide phone service to villages in Africa. You want me to do that one more time? Bob Johnson, founder of the Black Entertainment Network, who was the boss of one of his talk show hostesses, was married to Bill Cohen, the Secretary of Defense. So he comes to the aid of a group of African-American investors who are all friends of Jesse Jackson, who don't like the way Dan Colussy is being treated, and they think that Iridium can be used for communications in remote African villages. Hence, one of the oddest business partnerships in history is formed. But they still don't have enough money, and so they seek additional funding from a Saudi Arabian prince who's still interested in investing. And this story gets stranger still. So doing the book, I went on this journey that took me all over the country, interviewing some of the thousands of people that were involved with Iridium, including the inventor, Ray Leopold, who lives in northwest Montana, which, by the way, Ray, is pretty much the hardest place in the country to get to in the continental United States. But Ray is a Chicago native and an Air Force guy and an expert on maneuver warfare, fighter plane tactics. I always want to say maneuvered warfare, but it's maneuver warfare, fighter plane tactics. Tactics that somehow you adapted to the business world. I never understood that. You can explain that again sometime. Formerly a teacher at the Air Force Academy and senior air staff at the Pentagon. And Ray is, in my opinion, Ray is a pure scientist who helped me greatly during the development of this book, and probably got irritated with the number of times I called him asking him to explain scientific issues and engineering problems. And at one point he said to me, John, aren't you an English major? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, you know, when I went to high school, they made me take English. And then when I went to the Air Force Academy, they made me take English. And then when I got my master's degree, they made me take English. And when I got my PhD, they were still making me take English. Yeah. How many engineering courses did they make you take? And he has a point. So the way the story plays out, it's full of twists and turns and dirty tricks and revenge, and it's a sort of secret history of the 4 or 5 people who saved Iridium. But I wanted to wind up my remarks with a few things that just totally amazed me about this story. There's a lot of rocket science in this story. Because of the complexity of Iridium, the satellites had to be launched in combinations of 7, 5, and 2. You had 11 satellites on each plane plus 1 spare, so 12. I'm sorry. Yeah, is that right? But anyway, it came out to 7, 5, and 2 somehow. I don't know why. The chief rocket guy, a guy named Danny Stamp, had worked in the Air Force doing spy satellites all his life, and he hated American rockets. He thought that they were the most undependable rockets in the world, and he loved Russian rockets, and he especially loved the Proton rocket, which was the only satellite in the world which was large enough, the only rocket in the world which was large enough to carry 7 satellites into space. And he also loved a Chinese rocket called the Long March that was perfect for the 2 satellite launches. And so he begged his bosses. He said, I just want to launch this whole thing on Russian and Chinese satellites. And they said, no, 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 no. Bad publicity, Danny. You're not going to do that. So they put pressure on him to use at least 1 American rocket. So reluctantly, he decided to use the Delta II, which at that time was owned by McDonnell Douglas, for the 5 satellite launches. So launches were made from 3 countries: United States, Kazakhstan, which is where the Russians do their launches, and China. Now, Vandenberg Air Force Base in Lompoc, I don't know if any of you worked there, Most people don't know that Vandenberg has a lot more space launches than Cape Canaveral. But most of them are secret launches because they're spy satellites, or they're nuclear delivery satellites that are aimed at that island in the Pacific that we've pretty much blown to smithereens over the years, Kwajalein Island. And the reason Vandenberg figures in this book is that it's the only place in America where it's possible to do polar orbits as opposed to equatorial orbits. The 66, Iridium satellites are in polar orbit, and it's actually illegal to launch a polar orbit from Cape Canaveral, because if you were launching to the north, you'd have to fly over Charleston, Charlotte, Buffalo, and Toronto, and if you were launching to the south, you'd have to fly over Quito and Bogota. So the United States thinks it's a bad idea to launch low-flying rockets over major population areas. However, many of the Iridium satellites were launched from China, and they don't care. They go right over the cities, and in fact, in the 90s, they apparently wiped out a couple of villages. I mean, we've never been able to find out exactly what happened, but they continue to make those polar launches from anywhere. So anyway, Vandenberg Air Force Base sits out on this peninsula that juts out in the Pacific, so when you do the polar launch, the first landmass you cross is in Antarctica. And the only city in the world that's in danger from a Vandenberg launch is Lompoc, California. So the Air Force made a deal with Lompoc that they have a safety standard. 6 dead civilians. That's the maximum you can have. 7 dead civilians is too many, and this is apparently okay with the people of Lompoc, all except for the 6 dead ones. So, but the most reliable rocket in the world, both then and now, is the Proton, which is the Russian rocket and one of the biggest rockets ever used. So Danny Stamp was one of the first Americans to go to Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan after the end of the Cold War. If he'd gone there 2 years earlier, they would have shot him on sight because he was an Air Force lieutenant colonel. And so he's walking around Baikonur, the first American there, and he's noticing they have a lot of superstitions there. For example, if a rocket blows up at Baikonur, they just leave it there. They just leave the launch pad and the debris and everything because they're superstitious. It blew up, don't touch it, leave it there, let nature take it over. And so they have all these places there that look like ancient ruins where they had failed launches. And then the other thing, they said, you want to go to the launch pad one day? And he says, sure. And so they go to the launch pad, and it's about 2 kilometers to the launch pad, and you ride on a bus. And about halfway to the launch pad, the bus stops, and everybody gets out of the bus, and they go to the right rear tire, and they urinate on it. Everybody. And he says, what's going on here? And they say, well, Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, when he took off, he asked to stop the bus, and he went and he urinated on the right rear tire, and he survived. And so we've been doing it ever since. So near the end of his time there, when he was trying to plan for the Russian launch, he said, I need to see the control room. He really got along well with all his Russian compatriots because he loves vodka. And he said, I need to see the control room where my men will be working. And the Russians went off in the corner, and they kind of talked among themselves. And they came back, and they said, you want to see the control room? And he says, yeah. And he said, well, we really can't show you the control room, but we can show you another control room that's exactly like the one that your men will be using. And Danny says, no, that's not good enough. I have to see the actual control room where my men will be working. The Russians go off in the corner, talk among themselves, whisper, whisper, whisper. They come back and they say, okay, Mr. Stamp, we're going to show you the control room. But on the way to the control room, we're going to walk through another room. And we would appreciate it if during that walk, you would stare straight down at the ground and walk as fast as possible and not look in either direction. And so the hair on his back of his neck kind of stood up. And he says, okay. And I said, Danny, what'd you do? And he says, I walked as slow as possible, and I moved my head as much as I could to see everything in the room. And I said, and what did you see? And he said, I saw a map, a giant map on the wall of the former Soviet Union at the bottom, an upside-down map of Canada and the United States at the top, and blinking lights showing the location of every active ICBM in the world. And I said, what does that mean? And he says, it was the war room, and they were on active alert. For whatever paranoid reason, they were still on active alert. And I said, so what did you do? And I said, well, let's have some more vodka. The new global corporation has to get along. So I thought that was interesting. By the way, the satellites still fly today. A second generation is going up soon. It was supposed to go up in September, but the Falcon 9 rocket blew up, and they're doing an investigation to see what caused that problem. It wasn't an Iridium launch where it blew up. It was another launch. Most people know the Iridium phone from the movies. Robert Downey Jr. uses one in all the Iron Man movies. Clive Cussler uses the Iridium phone in all the Dirk Pitt stories. Brad Pitt fights zombies and saves the world with an Iridium phone in World War Z. And probably the most famous scene using an Iridium phone is Bradley Cooper in American Sniper. At the end of the movie, he executes the longest kill shot in history, and he's kind of shaken. And he picks up the phone and he extends the antenna, and he says, "I'm ready to come home now, baby." And most people remember that scene from the movie, and that's the Iridium phone in its most dramatic, cinematic moment. There were three events, though, that made Iridium famous. 9/11, it was the only phone that worked on the island of Manhattan. Hurricane Katrina, it had been used in earlier disasters, but for Hurricane Katrina, it knocked out the whole infrastructure of southern Louisiana, and it was the only thing that first responders could use. And Afghanistan, a lot more than Iraq. There are Iridium traditions today. When you get to Mount Everest, first thing you do is you don't plant a flag. You pick up the phone and say, "Guess where I am?" on an Iridium phone. Same thing when you go to the South Pole. It's become standard safety equipment for most of the relief organizations in the world. And none of these things would have been possible were it not for the three people with me today. Because on Labor Day weekend 2000, Danny Stamp was summoned to Motorola headquarters in Schaumburg, Illinois, and told that as soon as he received a call from the company's CEO, he was expected to deorbit the entire constellation. They always used euphemisms for, deorbit, decommission, liquidate. They never said knock them out of the sky. So the suicide software had been written. They were just waiting on one single fax from a Belgian insurance company, and then Danny was going to call the Mission Control Center in Virginia, and they would use the hydrazine thruster that normally keeps the satellite in place to jolt the satellites out of orbit. And then Dorothy Robyn, working on a Sunday afternoon, managed to track down a Motorola executive at a baseball game and told him, "I really don't think you should do this. I think you should come to the Pentagon on Tuesday." And at the 59th minute of the 11th hour, the constellation was saved, and Dan Colussy's little group of investors got the system out of bankruptcy for $6.5 million in cash, and managed to run it on a shoestring budget because they used all their money to keep the satellites flying for 4 years, until a day in May of 2004 when suddenly they had the system overloaded. And the system, they didn't understand how the system could overload. And they checked at the operations center and they checked at the Earth station. What's going on? What's going on? And they found out that, we have all these dropped calls because all these calls are going to one satellite. And the reason is because there were 148,000 American soldiers, airmen, and Marines stationed in Iraq, and it was Mother's Day. So the only thing that can overload the Iridium system is a war zone on Mother's Day. And then a few months later, a business writer for USA Today was trying to come up with a comparison for a business deal for that little money that resulted in a permanent resource worth $1 billion or more that would last indefinitely into the future. And the only one he could come up with was the Louisiana Purchase. So I love happy endings like that, and these three people were the only people who believed that a happy ending was possible. So thank you very much, and thank you guys. Yeah, come on up. We're going to have a brief panel discussion with the three heroes of the book, and then we'll take questions. Yeah. Yeah, have a seat. Or we can go directly to questions if you guys have any urgent questions you feel like you have to ask. Yeah. Okay. Okay, Ray, why don't you talk? On that day in 1987 when you guys came up with the idea for Iridium, did you really believe in it?
Yeah, we believed in it. We didn't know how we were going to make everything happen, but We had a lot of confidence. That's one thing that Barry Bertiger, Ken Peterson, and I didn't lack. We figured we'd come up with some way to make it happen. We figured out the details of how to put the system together and so forth. And working at Motorola at that time was the perfect place. We were able to build satellites like they'd never been built before. Even though the number was relatively small, like 100, we built them the same way we built cell phones or semiconductors. We used statistical process control. We controlled our vendors. We felt that we can employ the same principles that are used for mass production in satellites. And at the peak of our launch campaign, we were building one satellite every 4.3 days, and we were launching them on an average of one every 5.23 days, which is a pretty good pace. When you look at the best that was available in the industry, it was more like 18 months. So we kind of revolutionized the space industry in terms of how quickly you could build satellites, and you actually can make them more reliable by building them fast. Because the one thing that detracts from reliability is how often a human being can get their grubby hands where they don't belong. So you build them fast and you don't have that problem.
What did you think, Dorothy, when you first heard? That must have been a strange story when you walk into your office and the chief economic advisor is telling you that these satellites are going to be destroyed and you need to go talk to Jesse Jackson's people.
Well, I already knew that there was a threat to Iridium, and I had been dealing off and on with Iridium for a couple of years. The FBI had denied their license before the launch. That was my first encounter, fighting with the FBI to get them to release the block on the license of Iridium. DOD had a strong interest. I had dealt with the Department of Defense on Iridium. They had, at that point, built a secure gateway in Hawaii, a teleport, if you will. They had built a secure handset. So DOD had a definite interest in it, but they, at that point, with the prospect of deorbiting, and that, by the way, that was all about liability. Motorola had a very generous insurance policy to cover that only lasted a couple of years, and so they wanted to deorbit the satellites while they were covered by this insurance, or have complete indemnification from the buyer, and there was no buyer with a deep enough pocket to do that. So my problem was, how did I get the Defense Department to be sufficiently proactive? They had already decided they did not want to acquire the system and run it, and senior people in the Defense Department it was a nice to have, but they were not willing to, they were willing to continue to be a customer. They did not want to do any more than that. You are constantly being asked to go be outside of your swim lane when you're the Defense Department, and the culture is, and it needs to be, very much one of stick to our knitting, stay in our swim lane. So for me, the challenge was to get them to see sufficiently that the mission interest here was sufficiently strong that they would be proactive. At the same time, keep the president and my boss interested, and Sub-Saharan Africa was the key to that, but I didn't really want the Defense Department to know that that was the White House interest, because that's exactly the sort of thing that would make the Defense Department wary of being involved. So it was walking that fine line, keeping both of those balls in the air.
I think there's an email or a memo that says, whatever you do, don't mention villages in Africa at
Right.
the Pentagon.
Yes,
Yeah.
right.
So Dan, now I know that you had promised, I have a passage in my book about how Dan had retired. He was 69 years old. He very happily retired.
69 years old.
69. And you were learning to play golf because when you were younger, you thought that golf was just an excuse for businessmen to goof off. So you never learned to play it. And so you're learning to play golf, and you're very interested in your golf game. And then this thing comes up, and you've already promised your wife you won't run any more companies. And so what made you so obsessed that you had to follow this through to the end?
Well, it's it's pretty basic. I mean, I was still even though I was semi-retired, I was still quite interested in business activities. And the Iridium was special. I mean, I was a user of it. In fact, I was taking a sailboat to the Panama Canal. When I was using it, it worked beautifully. You could call home, you could call anybody. And the Iridium made the announcement. They sent a little message saying, you know, the system will stop as of a certain date and so forth. And I couldn't believe it because the thing was working so good. It didn't cost that much. And I had a friend who had an investment banking firm in New York that I had worked with in the past. And so I get this crazy idea that, well, if nobody wants this thing, then why don't we try to acquire it? I mean, if it works well, if we get it at the right price. So I started to look into the economics, and it turned out to be very simple. I mean, even though they were losing hundreds of millions of dollars, it was because of the cost connected with the debt they had, and also the enormous charges that Motorola was putting on them. I mean, they were borrowing money to pay Motorola. Motorola only owned 18% of Iridium. So the numbers I could do in the back of an envelope, frankly, because it was that simple. If we stopped paying Motorola $45 million a month to run the constellation, I looked at the number of people required in the SNOG up near Dulles, and also down in Chandler, and it was about $3 or $4 million a month. I'm saying, oh, wait a minute, now there's a little discrepancy here on these costs. Plus, they had 600 people in their corporate headquarters, and on and on and on. So instead of costing hundreds of millions of dollars a year to run, I got it down to like $70 million a year. Okay. So if something costs $70 million, you can still operate the constellation, and you can get enough. And they already have 60,000 users. Of course, they needed 1 million users to break even with their cost structure. So the company's in bankruptcy, and that means that the common shareholders, which I was one actually, have lost everything, and the bondholders who weren't secured lost everything. So billions of dollars of costs went away, and the only ones left were the banks. They were the secured creditors. There were 38 banks, and Chase was their spokesman. And then there was a woman that represented them, and then I got friendly with her, and I said, well, we should talk because I'm going to make you an offer on the Iridium. So he said, well, Craig McCaws looked at it, and he was talking $600 million. And I said, well, I've looked at this very carefully, and the most that I can pay is $25 million. She looked at me like I had two heads and said, you've got to be kidding. That's chump change. And I said, well, that's my offer. And I went to the bankruptcy judge and convinced him that we had the capability to run the system, and that 25 was all we had, because I'd actually raised about $70 million, but we needed obviously money to run it once we bought it. And Motorola resisted it all the way. They thought I was out of my mind and didn't know anything, and pretty much brushed me off, but I was persistent. I went back and spent a lot of time at their headquarters, visited other service providers, found that there's a lot of interest still in Iridium, and made a lot of visits to the Pentagon, and found out that there was a lot of interest in the Pentagon. When you get down to the working levels, the top generals, they weren't sure. It was too complicated for them. But the worker bees, the people that were actually out, and the Marines especially, were very interested in keeping the system. So I was able to get them to sign a contract, a small one. It was for 20,000 phones, which they already own, most of them, and they had their own secure gateway in Hawaii anyhow, which they already invested about $150 million in. So I was able to get a contract, a tentative contract from them, and which showed that I would get this revenue, and that would be enough combined if we could get some of our civilian customers back. So I was able to raise some money. My primary source was going to be my wonderful friend and classmate, who John mentioned, backed out on me right in the middle of everything in a very public way, which didn't help my fundraising activities much. But to make a long story short, we raised, had $70 or $80 million, and Motorola threw me a last-ditch problem. They said that we had to put up a letter of credit for $30 million because, they were going to sell us phones because we were this company with no money, and they needed to have that, money backed up with a line of credit. And I said, I don't have $30 million, but I'll tell you what, you can loan it to me. And I'll give you a piece of the action, and, in 10 years, if we're successful, you can get paid at a very good rate. So they scoffed at that and laughed at it. Guess what? They accepted. So we cobbled together this type of financing, and it worked. And so we acquired the company with the help of Dorothy, and actually Ray and I had never met. I knew a lot about him, obviously. I think the overriding thing is the system worked beautifully. Okay, it worked. And that helped because everybody that used it loved the phone. I mean, the Marines loved it. All the service people loved it because it worked. They could call home. They could call their company commander. They could call whoever. And they started to net it where you could, in fact, the Marines invested their own money where they could press one button and talk to a whole network. Just like a dispatcher does when he's got a whole series of trucks to manage. They could do the same thing. And so now the DoD is about 20% of our revenues, but it's mostly commercial users, and it's mostly industrial users and government users. It's companies that have remote operations. And even though Motorola scoffed at, the most successful part of the company now is what we call M2M, machine to machine, where we have a device now that's 1 inch square, literally, that I can put on a piece of Caterpillar equipment. Let's use them as an example. That might cost $500,000, and it's in the jungles of Indonesia. And we can measure exactly, and it's got a GPS unit on it and a 3-year battery, okay, and it's this big. And it can access the constellation. We know exactly where it is. We can measure 30 parameters, engine temperatures, pressures, GLOs, you name it. So asset tracking and monitoring is now 50% of our business. It's data. Motorola said this will never be used for data. I said, wait a minute, I mean, there's small burst data, and what's wrong with that? I think they were a telephone company. This is a company, companies do get myopia. They're used to voice, and they were a voice company, and that's all they thought about. Ray, you may disagree, but since you were in the company.
Let me mention the most exciting app that's coming up for Iridium. When they launch the 2nd generation, Iridium will be able to have a two-way contact with every airliner in the world. So at the present time, if you fly from New York to London, for example, across the most heavily traveled corridor on the planet, you go off the grid once you're beyond Newfoundland.
200 miles.
So the planes have to be kept 5 miles apart, and
15 miles.
15 miles? And so they don't know exactly where they are. But when the 2nd generation of Iridium goes up, we will never again have a Malaysian airliner disappear. We will know where every plane is, where it goes down, what happens to it. So that's one of the exciting things. And one thing that Dan didn't mention, I want to mention 2 things. One is when you got to the final closing with the bankruptcy court, you told Chase Manhattan, I don't have the 25 million. I've only got 6.5. You need to loan me 18.5. And so they did. They loaned him $18.5 million so he could pay the final 25.
I wanted to save all the cash
because he needed cash to run the system. And then the other thing that struck me as very charming about Dan's business acumen is Dan was constantly going to meetings where the other side had 12, 14, 15 people on the other side of the conference table, and I was like, Dan, did you ever take a PowerPoint, a lawyer, an advisor? Nope. It was always just him and his spiral notebook to take notes with. And so he went to the Pentagon and the White House and Motorola, and he did all these massively complicated meetings with, didn't even take his laptop, just took his notebook. If you ever go to the Pentagon, which I'm sure many of you have been there, everybody arrives with massive teams to meet the generals, And Dan's business style is just, well, they can ask me questions and I'll ask them questions, so that's one of the great things. I should also mention, I made a big deal in the book about you coming out of retirement at 69 to do this. And now you're 85 and you're still running 3 companies. So it's not such a big deal that he came out of retirement at 69.
Why should I quit? It's fun.
Yeah. Right. One business question that's not answered in the book.
Dan, I have a question about the Motorola business that I didn't see answered in the book. And it's Motorola looks, obviously they're just absolutely focused on ending their financial exposure and wanting to deal with the spacecraft, which seems insane. But didn't they get every nickel back? They had the back charges that were huge to Iridium. I got the impression, but there was never a number, that Motorola actually got paid. Is that true?
Motorola was getting paid.
Yeah. And really, they got their investment back.
Yeah, and John figured this out in the book. Iridium could have been saved. They could have done what I did, of course, very easily and simply. But if they would have just withheld, remember I told you they were paying $45 million. Iridium was paying Motorola $45 million a month for like 100 engineers. Well, you guys are engineers, you know how much engineers get paid, so figure it out. And so they could have solved that whole problem by just deferring those payments, because Iridium still had about $150 million in cash.
Yeah. And
all they had to do was say, okay, we'll just defer these payments until the company can pay us. They wouldn't have to cancel them even, but they wouldn't do it.
Yeah, as a Motorola guy, I'll tell you, there was Motorola and there was Motorola. The people that were making these decisions were at the corporate headquarters in Schaumburg, Illinois, outside of Chicago. I was down in Arizona with the technical
Siberia.
team. Yeah, and there were thousands of people that made this happen, and most of them were technical people. And with respect to the apps, I think John does mention in the book, I've given over 1,000 Iridium presentations, and I'd usually end by saying I had, at the time, 5 young kids. And 10 or 15 years from now, by the time they're teenagers, they'll be able to dream up uses for Iridium that all of us collectively in the room today cannot even imagine. And that certainly has come true. But the other thing I'll tell you is the people that put the system together, the people that created the system, we had no doubt about these things. But for the most part, we didn't even know these conversations were happening. We built Iridium, we put it into operation, it was operating very well, and we were on to other things. And as these discussions were happening in Illinois, we were totally oblivious to them. And when I first learned about it, is when John asked me to read a draft of his book.
Another question here.
I hope this is a technical question. What is the contingency plan or protection of the system in case of a serious solar storm or a mass coronal ejection? Is it to relaunch as soon as possible?
Well, first of all, Ray can comment on this. We're not bothered by storms like the fixed satellites, the GEOs. So we don't have any storms, but we do have an emergency gateway which on the same latitude as Tempe, Arizona, in Fairbanks, Alaska. So if we had any problem with our gateway in Arizona, we would immediately switch within microseconds to the gateway in Alaska, which could then resume the same distribution of the calls. So we're pretty safe on all of the contingency that can happen. We have spares in space. The spares are getting low now, but we're getting ready to launch. In fact, we were scheduled to launch September 15th from Vandenberg, our first 10 second-generation satellites, which will be broader band. Of course, you all will understand this. These satellites and the materials were put together in the mid to late 90s. Yeah. And every component, the processor, the antennas, everything is, half the weight and double the capacity. So when you build a new one, our system is going to be broadband. It's going to be a much finer system. So that'll be launched through probably now get into 2018, because we have to launch 70 satellites. So 10 per rocket, and we're using SpaceX, the Falcon 9, which had this one blow up, but luckily it was nothing to do with the rocket. It was due to the fueling. But we're waiting for SpaceX to sort that out before we can resume our launches. We're hoping we'll do it before the end of the year, because we're anxious to, and that's costing us $3.5 billion, which we were able to finance.
So due to time, we just have time for this one last question, and then we'll have to continue the conversation out in the lobby during the reception.
Okay.
You've begun to answer, but I was going to ask about possibilities of large increases in capacity through use of multi-antenna MIMO technologies and fine-grained sectorization, narrow beam. To what extent have these enhancements been introduced or will be introduced?
Ray?
Yeah, well, the architecture for the second-generation satellite, the communication system architecture for the second-generation satellite is basically the same as what we created back in the late 80s and early 90s. The amount of spectrum that's available for the system is the same. There's no additional spectrum. In terms of spectral efficiency, each one of the satellites is able to create up to 48 beams, and those beams are like cells in the cellular telephone network, so you get the reuse in that way, and then with the 66 satellites. And because of the overlap, as the satellites get closer to the poles, some of those beams are turned off, and at any one point in time, about 2/3 of the beams, 66 times 48, about 2/3 of the beams are turned on. What's being added to the next generation satellites is a better exploitation of the feeder link. Feeder links have a lot of capacity, the K-band links, 19 and 29 gigahertz, and that's being exploited much better. Imagine this. We put the Iridium system together, and it's operated over the entire world, and for most of the places, the user links to go to the handsets is 5.25 megahertz. That's less than one over-the-air TV station. Okay? The satellites were built for 10.5 megahertz, but in many places only 5.25 megahertz of spectrum is available. But even that spectrum, the company that's operating the system right now has found better ways to exploit that technology.